This episode is sponsored by Moschio Prosecco. Want to sell sparklers and 187s? Moschio has them in Brut, Extra Dry, and Rosé. Look for the 12-bottle party pack.
Today you'll hear from Jon McDaniel, founder of Second City Soil in Chicago and one of Food and Wine Magazine's 2018 Sommeliers of the Year. Jon says the wine selling process is not just outdated, it's broken. He explains how it can be fixed, as well as why being a sommelier is a dying profession.
This is Wine Biz 360, in-depth coverage of the wine industry. For wine professionals, by wine professionals. Here is your host, Joe Janisch.
Thank you for downloading this episode of Wine Biz 360. I'm your host, Joe Janisch. Our guest today is Jon McDaniel of Second City Soil in Chicago. Jon's worked at just about every level of the wine industry. He's run restaurants, he's worked at retail shops, he's been in export, distribution, he's even been a winemaker. Although most probably know him best as a sommelier. And in fact, in 2018, Food and Wine Magazine named him one of their Sommeliers of the Year. And in 2017, Wine Enthusiast named him one of their under 40 tastemakers. So, Jon, such a pleasure to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So you're pretty much on a mission to transform the wine scene in Chicago with Second City Soil. You previously were at Gage Hospitality Group, and you've recently gone off on your own with Second City. Can you just give us a little bit about what went into that decision and what you're doing with Second City Soil?
Certainly. So, Second City Soil really was born from, my realization that you have to be your own best PR agent when it comes to being a sommelier in the wine business, of just making those connections, creating content for yourself and for the people that, you're trying to promote. And so I started it while still working in the restaurants, and really it was meant to be a blog. It was meant to be something of just creating content for my peer sommeliers, of saying like, hey, they're doing something cool at this restaurant in Chicago and those kind of things. And when I realized that I best serve the wine industry not by working 5 lunches in a restaurant, but of really, getting out there in the world and making better connections for buyers and sellers, it was a pretty easy decision to kind of use the brand that I already created and use that as the platform for the company that I now have as Second City Soil.
That sounds pretty good, because as you said, usually a beverage director or a lead sommelier doesn't really have the time to do a lot of the promotion or the content. You've been in that role and you've seen it. So I imagine you're bringing a pretty good value to the restaurants that you're working with.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is, if you look at the great PR agencies or the great marketing entities for different restaurants, the people that are in those positions, they're not wine people, they're marketing people. And really to have the specific terminology, to have the specific, like, hey, this is something exciting that we're doing, you really need to involve the wine director in that kind of a conversation so that they can go out there and create the pitches to create these opportunities for coverage of what you're doing. And I realized pretty early on that it was so much easier for me to just create relationships. And so, a few years ago, I flew out to New York, and I went and basically knocked on the doors of Wine Spectator. I had lunch in the middle of nowhere in New York where Wine Enthusiast was. And I had, so I basically pitched what I was doing in the restaurants directly with the people that mattered, because Chicago is one of those places that if you look at most of the coverage of wine and of sommeliers and of restaurants dealing with wine, it's mostly New York and San Francisco, and Chicago is really forgotten about, even for how big of a city it is.
Yeah, and it really is a shame, because Chicago does have a thriving restaurant scene. It's just that it just doesn't seem to be seen as one of those places where people are drinking a lot of wine.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the culture and the core of Chicago as a city is not white collar wine drinker. That's what, I think people sometimes think of wine as having to be a sophisticated beverage, where Chicago is a beer, whiskey, blue collar, German and Polish, immigrant kind of a town. And for how amazing the restaurant scene here is, it's even, you look at the reviews of those restaurants, even for a great wine program, trying to even get the word wine mentioned in the review is sometimes really hard.
Yeah. So what wine with Kabasi then?
You know, you gotta mix it up with some Grand Gruner, and there's a lot of good stuff that go with this kind of things, and it's really finding opportunities to create wine as being as fun as cocktails, as fun as beer. Chicago is a great craft brewery movement, and they have fun names, and they use ingredients that people are like, wow, that's cool. And wine doesn't have that on its own. I mean, it's a more natural product than beer and cocktails can be. And it's sometimes looked at as just kind of boring and uppity. And so how I can create restaurant wine lists, how I can create content for my peers here in the city, that you have to be fun. You have to be in a position where everybody is looking at the sommelier as based off of that silly movie that came out about four guys trying to pass a test. And the wine business is much more than just those four guys trying to pass a test. Right.
Now, you've mentioned creating content a few times, and I think that's something that a lot of restaurant people they may not really understand what you're talking about. And, you also mentioned PR and public PR agencies. Maybe you could help us understand what the difference is between, like, in PR, it might be somebody thinking, well, I just send out a press release about my restaurant or something like that. But you go way beyond that, because why don't you talk about some of the things you do to actually create content? I mean, is it like viral videos? Is it blogs? Is it newsletters? Like, give us a little taste of some of the different things that you do.
Well, I think first you have to really look at an honest answer of yourself as a sommelier of, what am I doing in the restaurant that is different than the guy across the street or the girl across the street from me? And I think that's the one part of it, of how, as creating a wine program, why is it any different than just listing wines on a menu? And so really, when you look at the content, it all starts with the wine list. There are so many concepts in any city in America that you don't need a sommelier, you don't need a wine director, you just need a thoughtful list that acts as the sommelier. And so any list that I write, I make sure that there are descriptions and that they give those kind of buzzwords, so that when a guest is reading it, it gives confidence to my service staff of saying, all right, I at least know that there are 5 or 6 words that are being described about that wine. That's really where it starts. And so then it's taking that kind of creativity, and it's not just listing for a wine, this tastes like blueberries and whatever, but making it a little bit fun, making it a little bit sarcastic, and those kind of things, I think, have always been the greatest success that I've had, of just showing the wine list, to sending it to Ray Isle at Food and Wine, and showing the editors at Wine Spectator, and be like, this is what I'm up to now. This is what I'm doing that's different. These are the events that I'm putting on. These are the different dinners and programs. I'm trying to make wine fun for my guests. And that's what's attractive to all these different entities. They don't want to just write about a product. They want to write about how wine can be exciting, because that's what their readers are looking for. So that's the first part of it for me, has always been the content that I'm creating in the list. And then it's putting yourself out there in the world, much like a chef is a celebrity in a restaurant. The wine person is also one of those people that a guest is coming into the restaurant specifically to talk to that person. And I've had guests that, read my bio online and these kind of things, and they're excited to come in and talk to me, because I'm not just another person pouring wine. I'm kind of a quirky guy, and I want people to experience that kind of quirkiness, that kind of, little bit of sassiness in what's happening in the wine list. And then that's what you take out there into the world, and you show these different entities through social media. And if you're going to post a photo of a bottle on Instagram, it's not just, hey, I drank Romani Conti tonight. It's, I did that with McDonald's, or, I drank this wine and this is what I thought about it. And just giving something that is different than the same ho-hum, this is a bottle of wine, it tastes like this, and it was good, and that was all I have to say about it. You have to be creative in a way that the wine industry is very slow to catch up to the rest of the beverage world on fun and creativity.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Probably all of the Instagrams I see about people putting up their pictures of their wine they had, it's just basically a picture of the bottle and maybe a picture of the dish, and like, wow, this was delicious. And I mean, other than that, it doesn't really help me very much. Now, not everyone has your level of experience and knowledge of wine. So when you go into a restaurant and you start out with maybe building some content and helping out with getting the wine descriptions going, how can you empower the waitstaff and some of the servers to feel confident and sell more wine to their customers?
I just started with a new restaurant group called Farmhouse here in Chicago, and it's a casual neighborhood, really farm to table kind of a place. And the first thing that, I did when I started talking to the service staff is talk about how wine is an ingredient. If you are taking a glass of Sauvignon Blanc and you want to add that to a dish, is it going to make it better? Is it going to make it worse? Look at those kind of just very basic things about just thinking about how wine can be an addition to the experience. It's impossible to get someone to order an extra cheeseburger or another steak, but they can get a second glass of wine. And then imagine that if that server, who sometimes is hesitant to even ask if they want another glass of wine, what if they did that 5 times a night, 4 times a week? That's 20 extra glasses of wine that they sold. Let's say that it's $10 a glass. That's an extra $200 that they sold. Let's say that they get 20% on that, and that's an additional $40 that they made in that week. Now you look at how many times you can do that in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year. And I look at when I come into a restaurant, the first thing I say to the service staff is that if you listen to me, I will get you a free month of rent.
Wow.
Servers, they're not there because they want to be lifetime restaurant hospitality people. Some people want to go into management and learn to be sommeliers, et cetera, et cetera. Most people are just trying to figure out life and get through this week and pay the bills. And once you understand that the service staff they're there to make money. And, if they have kids or they're trying to pay for college or whatever the situation is, they're there to make money. And if you give them the tools to understand that there is no other revenue stream in the restaurant that can sell and can earn them as much money as selling wine, the light goes on. I watch it in their eyes when I say that free month of rent line, and every one of them, they're locked in.
Yeah, money is a motivator. It doesn't matter who you are.
And it's a very cold black and white way to look at it a little bit. But I mean, we have to be realistic as far as why your service staff is there and why are they going to listen to you? They're not going to listen to you when you get wax poetic about Combergian soil in Chablis. They don't care.
Right.
Because the reality is that how can you translate when they have 400 different products of food and beverage, all the things they have to spiel to the guests at the first part, hopefully they remember their name, all these kind of things. And you want to then have them translate soil type information to a guest. You have instead about 12 seconds to talk about wine. What is the 12-second pitch? And that's when I travel to wineries, when I go around, I'm asking these producers, these winemakers, what's the 12-second version of why your wine should be sold in my restaurants? And if they can't come up with it, I usually don't buy it because I can't translate that to my service staff of a 3-minute exposition on why, chestnut wood is important. It's not important to my servers and it's not important to the guests. It's how is this going to go well with what I'm doing? Is it fairly priced? And am I going to enjoy it? And once you get your service staff hooked on, I'm going to give you the information that you need to know to translate tableside because you don't have a sommelier to back you up. The menu is backing you up. It's a totally different experience than what they're used to, and it becomes more successful for them.
Yeah, and it's actually a brilliant way to get the wait staff involved and motivated because I'm sure, as you know, the young wait staff don't hang around very long. Usually there's a lot of turnover and you're constantly retraining and retraining. And based on what you're saying, your wait staff doesn't need to be a wine expert. They just need to know how to sell the wines that are on the list to the customer, which makes it a heck of a lot easier, I would think.
Yeah, and it's just really because their confidence is so low about it, because the reality is that most of them are millennial or millennial plus or whatever you want to categorize them at. they're not going home and drinking Montalcino. They're not going home and drinking Burgundy. They're going home and drinking whatever handle of vodka is in the freezer or whatever, craft beer that they picked up on the way home. They're not drinking wine in the context of what the restaurant is. So how do you give them that kind of material that all they have to do is feel like that they're one step ahead? They have one more piece of information than their guest does. If they feel like they have just a little bit more knowledge than the guest might have, that's all they have to start with. That little bit of confidence to say, you know what, I learned something today in pre-shift. I learned something today in our tastings. It's like yesterday when I was tasting with this new restaurant, we tasted New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc against Sancerre, both Sauvignon Blanc. A guest is going to ask a question, well, what's the difference between these two? If I can give the server that 5 or 6 words worth of, well, this one is fruitier, this one is drier, this one is better with this dish, this one is better with this dish. That's really the baseline of what you have to build. You have to build that foundation of, I can manage through the menu so that I can help the guest manage through the menu. And if you can start there, you really start to see their confidence building. And then they come back next training, they ask questions. They say, hey, we've never tried this Austrian Zweigelt that's on the list. What in the world is that? Because we never opened it before. Well, let's open it. Let's taste it. Let's, talk about it. How is it going to be comparative to what someone knows? Not just like, it's this red wine and that's it.
Yeah. Toward that end, you mentioned Zweigelt, and there are other amazing wines that the general population really has never heard of. Are you seeing with the younger customers that are coming in, some of those late 20s, early 30s, are they looking for these wild and crazy varietals from non-traditional places? Is that something that's trending in Chicago with the younger crowds?
I think a little bit. I think that the reality is, first, you have to realize that those kind of younger drinkers, you have to realize what they don't want to drink first. And what they don't want to drink is the same stuff that their parents drank. That's why you look at like wineries that were popular 10, 15 years ago. I hate to pick on Justin Winery, but that's always the example that I use when I talk about this. Justin was one of the most collected wines of California. And you look at it now and you don't see it on restaurant wine lists anymore. You see Isosceles a little bit because it still has that name recognition. But the reality is that 26-year-old drinker that is just starting to learn about what they like in wine, if they see that on the list or they see that in a shop, they're like, well, that's what my dad drinks. I don't want to drink that.
Right.
That's, I think, the first reality. So I think they're open a little bit more to places because more of them are studying abroad when they're in college. And so they come back, they did a semester in Spain and they'll be like, oh, like I may have had this when I was in Spain traveling or these kind of things. So I think that younger generation is exposed to just more places around the globe. And so they understand, I think, a little bit better that wines come from everywhere and it's not just what's in your backyard. And that's kind of step one. And then step two is getting the service staff to be excited about it. I have a restaurant that it's a sushi restaurant and the service staff was all about sake. And then they realized they couldn't sell sake. And then we're starting to get into wine as a staff. We're tasting a lot of the different food with the wine. And there's one wine that it's the most popular wine that I've ever seen a service staff like get super excited about. It's this wine from Verona, right outside. It's called Ferdi. It's like Garganega. It's like Suave, but not Suave, which nobody understands what Suave is in the restaurant. Nobody understands or can barely pronounce Garganega. But they're like, oh, we love that Ferdi wine. That's the one that they like always talk about. And it's the one that's most popular for the staff. And they sell it like they invented it. And that's the kind of thing of like, because the service staff is millennial and they are learning about it too, when they discover something that is not just boring Chardonnay or boring Merlot or whatever, when they get excited about it, that's when you see that they're connecting with a guest that is basically them. And they can sell those kind of things to people. And so if you get a service staff to say like, hey, there's this cool new wine. It's like the anti-Chardonnay. They're like, oh, okay, that's cool. Because everyone always asks for Chardonnay and they don't even look at the menu. And I kind of feel like I'm just taking orders and I don't even really need to be here. I can say like, oh, if you like Chardonnay, you should drink this instead. And I really like it. And I don't like Chardonnay and all these kind of things of if you get the service staff hooked on something, then they can hook the wine drinker that is also learning as well. And I think it all starts with your staff.
Right. And a big part of it, it seems, I'm a little older, so for me, it was the brands and the brand marketing would kind of influence me, and I would, see advertising or whatever. But it seems to me that the younger generation is more about discovering. And like you said, that they discovered this wine Fairty and made it their own. Do you see that as kind of like maybe the goal for some restaurant wine lists, to try to put out these wines and have them discovered more than like just tell them this is a great wine, so that they can kind of like own it a little more?
I think it depends on what the restaurant concept is. I mean, if you look at Gruner Veltliner is a great example of like that grape didn't even exist really in the US until like a couple sommeliers in New York got hooked on it, and then it trickles down to somms all over the country. And it was like that cool hip sommelier wine. So there's that kind of part of it where the sommelier is basically trying to justify their existence in the world and in the restaurant. And so they're trying to be the ones to discover new things, to, put something out there into the world. That's why I always laugh at, like, I've watched guests that will order a Chardonnay from the sommelier and they'll bring back a Chardonnay from Jura. And I know immediately that that's not actually what the guest meant. But sommeliers are so hooked on Jura, they're so hooked on like it being the cool new place, that that's what they want to kind of push without understanding exactly what the guest is looking for. And so restaurants, you have to understand, my goal for the concepts that I'm working the list for is, how do you move someone kind of 10% away from what they know? Sometimes that is having a varietal that is common, that is a new producer that they may have not heard of, or a new place. There has to be some sort of comfort in everything that they're doing. Maybe it's compared to one of these kind of classic things, but you can't just jump someone off the deep end, because what if they don't like it? You have to play those kind of first things very safe and move them in the right direction so that you can earn the trust of your guest. You can earn the trust of your service staff, because if you go out there and you say, all right, team, we're going to start pouring this random varietal from Greece that 10% of the people may like. And when they go tableside and they get 3 or 4 people that say like, actually, you know what? I don't like this. It creates conflict at the table, that I'm not at the table because I just write the wine list. And so it's the servers that are having to feel that negative experience. And then they just stop selling the wine, and then they stop trusting you. So you have to find those wins, those things that you know that the staff is going to get behind, that the guest is going to get behind, move them just a little bit away from comfort. And then you can kind of bring in those things that are a little bit more strange, that are a little bit more unique and that no one has heard of, to say like, all right, we had success with this wine last time. We're going to move just a little bit over to the right, a little bit over to the left from that. And that's what you can continually compare it back to over and over again, is there's something that is comfortable about this. And now the service staff can be a little bit more comfortable because they've had successes at the table in the past. You need those kind of successes to build confidence.
Right. Now, let's switch gears a little bit, because I know that you have affinity for the business side of things and the economics of wine. Now, when you're building a wine program, helping a restaurant build a wine program, what are some of the things that you talk about from an economics point of view, and how a restaurant can be more profitable? Just some basics that you kind of just like start to introduce to the owner or the manager of the restaurant.
There are some things that it doesn't matter what your concept is, that people are going to order blindly, that they may not even look at the menu. They're just going to order it. One of those things, and the example I kind of use, is always New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc by the glass.
Right.
I ran a 700 bottle, 5 decades worth of wine list, in Chicago. It was an Italian restaurant called Accanto, and it was arguably one of the best Italian wine lists in the country. The amount of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc that I sold made me sick, just because people would ask for it. And I'm not going to be that guy to say like, well, we don't have it. You have to have a version of, I had it by the bottle. I had an Italian version of that by the glass. But you have to have those answers to things. Knowing that when you're building a wine list, and you're building a wine list for profitability, I had a great conversation with a sommelier the other day, and I asked her, well, why do you put this New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc on by the glass? She's like, well, I really like it. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is one of those things that the one that she put on the wine list, the cost to her was $13, and she was selling it for $13. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc should be like $9 cost to the
Right.
And the reality is that there's not one guest that walks into her restaurant and drinks a glass of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc that is going to care about that particular producer and that particular wine. They just want the style.
Right.
And so every bottle of wine is costing her restaurant $4 at least. If you start to build in those things and you start to build in wins automatically of everyone's going to ask for some sort of off dry to sweet Riesling, something like that. Do they care that it is from the Baden and it is a producer that only makes 1,000 cases of it? Or do they just want something with a little bit of residual sugar to it? Do they care that it is this, beautiful estate in Martinborough that, is 100% certified organic and they make 500 cases of it and it's super delicious? No, they want the aromatics. They want that grassiness, that grapefruit. That's all that the guest cares about. Once you understand in building a wine list what the guest cares about, then you can take advantage economically of that and start to build in profit from that, so that you can then pepper in those things that are a little bit more unusual or more exciting for you as a wine person, that you have to go a little bit shorter on your margins. But you have to build in these kind of wins that no matter what, you're going to make money on. And if you don't have those things and you just average everything out as saying like, well, my list is, every wine is 27% cost or whatever it is to get that magic number, you have to have things that are 18% and things that are 32%. You have to look at the end of how you get to that goal is by mixing those things in and by pouring things that are money makers. Like if you are looking at your rosé by the glass and you have this really cool Côte de Provence producer that is just amazing, the reality is that during the summer, people just want something that is pink and dry and light and delicious. And so if you're paying $12 instead of $7, it's really just your fault of why you're not making money. Because the reality is that the guest in most concepts don't care about the same things that you as a wine person cares about. And the sooner that you realize that they don't care and that they just want something that is a certain style, a certain deliciousness factor, one, hopefully they're going to order multiple glasses of it. So you're already up when it comes to that part of it. But you have to build in the profit in places that are going to be easy and that are going to be just, simple. And that's the part of it that a lot of sommeliers don't understand, is that they can be great theoretically in wine. They can be great and knowledgeable about every different microclimate, region, geography, exposition, blah, 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 blah. All very important to being a better wine person. But the reality is that, are you going to keep your job because you know about the slate of the Rheingau, or are you going to keep your job because you made your 25% cost this month? It's always going to be the latter. So you need to know the economics of it to keep your job as a wine person, because the reality is that the job of just a sommelier is not going to exist in 5 years. It's not a job in a restaurant that you can just sell wine on a floor and everything's going to be okay. It's just not possible in the reality of the restaurant business now.
That's a pretty bold statement. So how do you see the sommelier evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
It's going to be managers of restaurants that run wine programs. Because the reality is that, can you pay someone $50,000 a year, which is, in theory, a sommelier hopes to make more than that. Can you pay someone $50,000 a year just to run a wine program when you're just hoping to make a wine program profitable? And so even in my position, when I was a beverage director of 5 restaurants, I also was the general manager of one of them. And I was working 90 hours a week. 65 of those hours were dedicated towards the daily operation of a $4 million restaurant. 25 of those were running a $12 million wine program. that kind of economics, most operators don't understand. And it's very difficult to break those habits for them of seeing how the value of time spent developing and curating a profitable wine program is very different than having a body on the floor that covers managerial duties.
Right.
So when you are meeting with a distributor on trying to get your new spring glass placements, the reality is that you may have to interrupt that so you can go fire a busser. And that's the future of wine professionals in the restaurant business, is that you're going to be a manager. You have to be more than just wine. You have to bring value to your establishment, because it's very difficult to argue, I've made you 1% more profit over than the person before me, or we're doing better, because there's so much fluctuation when it comes to what people are drinking and costs and those kind of things. Your value is in your body on a restaurant floor doing stuff that has nothing to do with being a sommelier.
Right. You're talking right now about the selling part and the inside part of the restaurant, but then the other side of it is buying the wine, and that's involving the distributor rep or the salesperson. How do you get the restaurant and the distributor salesperson on the same text?
That's really why I exist as a company. Is I've seen over the last 15 years of how distributors sell wine is the exact same as they were doing 15 years ago. You take around a wine in a bag and you pour it and you talk about the price, and then you give the tech sheet, and then you walk away, and maybe you follow up, maybe you don't. You put on as a winery that you visit here, the city of Chicago, and I get invited to lunches almost every day of the week. I could eat free lunch every day just doing wine lunches. And that wine lunch is a 2-hour affair where you open up all the wines and you have 3 courses. You're looking at your watch the whole time. You're wondering, all right, well, I'm not going to be the first person to get up because I have to go to the restaurant. But as soon as one person gets up, then I'm going to be number 2. And everyone's looking around and trying to see, like, how the hell can I get out of this place? It's not a good thing for the winery. The distributor doesn't want to do it. The buyer, for some reason, only gets invited to that lunch 2 days before, even though the winery booked it 3 months before. And there's all these kind of parts of how people sell wine that it's a broken model, and it's an old model, and it doesn't take into account the fact that the buyer is, one, probably younger and is in over their head, and they're a manager as well, and they have to be on the floor in 45 minutes. But you want to talk about how important the last vintage was to you as a winery, and the winery is going to spend $1,000 for 8 people for a luncheon. That the reality is that the distributor is probably not going to follow up with those 8 buyers to be like, all right, I just paid for your lunch. Do you want to buy any of these wines? The winemaker thinks that the only time that they sell wine is when they're in the market, because when they go back again, they don't hear anything from the distributor. And everybody thinks that everyone else is basically not doing their job. And so how I fit into the gap is I look at, instead of having a 2-hour luncheon where we sit and talk about the wines and we enjoy lunch and whatever, let's spend 45 minutes and let's get people in a room on the way to the restaurant or whatever it is. And you just sit there and you open the wines and you talk about the wines, and you give the thumbs up, I like it, thumbs down, I don't. You make the distributor say, all right, these 5 people said, yes, they like it. 30 days from now, I expect some sort of information as far as like what you did with those hot leads, warm leads, whatever it is. We need to change how wine is being sold, because the buyer doesn't have the time to dedicate towards playing along. The distributor has, as consolidation happens between all these different portfolios, and Southern Glaciers is growing, and Breakthrough is going to merge with Republic National, and all these different things of wineries are getting lost. That's why wineries like Silver Oak are moving towards more medium distributors, because they want to be the jewel. They want to be able to hold the distributor to the fire and say, you need to go out and sell my wines, or I'm going to pull my wines. That's the reality. Is like a lot of wineries don't have the ability to say, hey, you know what? My wines need to be sold. You need to show my wines out there in the world. And it's amazing to me, being on kind of the other side, or on every side now, talking to different buyers and talking about a specific wine. And they say, I've never seen this wine before. I've never been shown this wine before. The amount of Italian wines that I've never been shown, even though I ran one of the best Italian wine programs in the country, is phenomenal. Like, I just don't understand why reps don't do that. I mean, the reality is that they have so many things that they have to make their numbers on, and all these different kind of questions and logistics. And why is it that you get a call on the last day of the month to say, hey, I need to sell 15 cases of Jordan Chardonnay, or my boss isn't going to let me leave this room. Well, why is it that you didn't spend the month saying to everybody, why didn't you call me on the 8th of the month and say, will you buy 6 bottles of Jordan Chardonnay? As opposed to, please, Jesus, buy 15 cases today so that I can go home.
Yeah.
It's a weird model, and I do work for different suppliers. And the reality is that, a supplier, you take a great Italian supplier, they can only hold the distributor responsible for numbers for probably the top 5 SKUs.
Mm.
Well, what happens with SKUs 6 through 10? You can't make the numbers for those. And so I kind of fit in I will go out there and I will create programming for SKUs 6 through 10, because your local rep is spending 50 hours a week trying to develop your top 5 SKUs, while the rest of everything, because you don't have the time to develop SKUs 6 through 10. What if you had an additional 10 hours a week to dedicate to your brands? What would you do with them? And so that's where Second City Soil kind of fits in the local market, is that I create those additional 10 hours for the distributor, for the supplier, to go out there and talk about the wines, to create programming for the wines, to create educational entities, to just have the exposure to the buyer, because those wines are not being shown by the distributor, and the buyers will never know that they exist otherwise.
Well, hallelujah to that, because, I've been in the wine business a little over 20 years now. And 20 years ago, that model kind of sort of worked, the one that we're still using today. But that, I think it was in Nielsen. Nielsen scans like 2,300 different brands of Pinot Grigio in the United States. And that kind of changes the whole ballgame. There's a reason why you probably haven't heard of different Italian wines or have been presented. There's just too much wine out there. And with all the consolidation, nobody's being given any attention from the supplier side. So it sounds like your concept and what you're doing with Second City Soil is exactly what the wine industry needs from both the supplier side and the restaurant side. Because as you said, if a restaurant is an Italian restaurant and they're not being presented some really cool, great wines that'll fit into their program, it's kind of hard to buy them. So that's brilliant, John. That's awesome stuff.
Most buyers don't know that they need it until they're shown it. Most of them can do as much studying as possible, but until they are actually exposed to the wine, until they actually taste the wine, I mean, that's how I'm, I guess, knowledgeable in some fashion about wine, is that I taste 300 wines a week. I'm out there tasting all the time. I am basically forcing the conversation, saying if you want me to buy this wine, if you want me to look at selling this wine, I have to taste it. I have to know what's going on, because I can read theoretically about it all the time. But that theoretical, tasting notes or whatever are the opinion of probably one person and one person alone, whether it be the winemaker or the marketing person that wrote those tasting notes. I read tasting notes about this Nebbiolo from Washington the other day that somebody gave 97 points to, and it used veal charcuterie as a tasting note. I've been in the wine business for 15 years. I have traveled all over the world. I lived in Italy for 3 years. I've never heard of veal charcuterie. And so how am I as a salesperson, how am I as a buyer, how am I as a guest, as a consumer, going to be oh, I've been waiting my entire life for a wine that tastes like veal charcuterie. I asked the chef that makes charcuterie as part of his business, what kind of charcuterie would be best with veal? And he's like, I've never even made it before, because you don't use veal for charcuterie. So how in the hell am I supposed to know what that tastes like? And you want to use that in tasting notes to sell a wine that, one, is a grape that nobody really knows outside of the place, that's from Washington, and you want to give it 97 points. I have no idea what just happened with that wine. Not a clue. And I'm certainly not going to buy it now.
Yeah, well, and I imagine it also smells like a new tennis ball can, right?
I mean, descriptions that people use, when I tell servers and when I start talking about a wine, I'm like, this is what I think this wine tastes like. If you have never had a grapefruit before, and I say that this wine tastes like grapefruit, how are you going to understand that? You need to write your subjective version of those notes. What are you tasting? You need to expand your vocabulary. I teach an undergrad class at a university here in Chicago, and I made them go online and look at different wine tasting notes and write down 15 words that they don't know what it is. And each one of them had like the most simple things. Someone didn't know what a pomegranate tasted like, or what cardamom was, or these kind of things. And these are words that as wine people, we try to use in our tasting notes to make it seem more sophisticated and better. But the reality is that most consumers don't know what cardamom is. They don't know. They understand like what baking spices are. They understand what fruitcake tastes like, but they don't know that that's cardamom as an example. And so how are we using these tasting notes of the same stuff over and over and over again? What is the difference between black cherry and Bing cherry? I couldn't tell you, and I eat it all day long.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is what we're basing our sales of wine on, and our like one-sheeter on this paragraph of stuff of pineapple confection. I have no idea what that means. And how is my guest going to know?
Yeah. You know, you said something earlier in our conversation about how wine should be more of an ingredient, and it kind of follows with the whole Italian concept of wine as food. And I think that might be an easier way to kind of have people understand wine a little better. I like the way you presented that more as like, okay, it's just like another ingredient, and maybe it'll taste pretty nicely with this type of a food or this type of a dish or this type of a sauce, rather than getting all high and mighty and elevated with the nuances of quince and cardamom and burnt rubber. It's
interesting. I mean, very early on in my career, I sold the wines of Betts and Scholl, which, Richard Betts, amazing master sommelier, amazing guy, does everything. And I've heard him talk maybe 74 times about his pitch. Each of those 74 times, the first phrase that came out of his mouth is, so it all starts with a tomato, and then you add salt, and then you add olive oil. It's verbatim every time, and it literally just breaks down flavor into, if you start with the tomato, if you don't start with the best tomato possible, it's not going to work out.
Right.
And you have to really bring it down to the baseline of what we're talking about here. It's grapes. And if you don't have the best grapes possible, you can't get to having them taste like raspberry parfait or whatever it is. So we have to get back to the core of what really we're talking about and who our end audience is, because most of us in the wine business, as the newer generation tries to get every color of lapel pin possible, the reality is that most master sommeliers leave the floor as soon as they become a master sommelier.
Exactly.
They're not back in front of the guest anymore. And there are some amazing hospitality people that are master sommeliers. I mean, Bobby Stuckey is my god when it comes to hospitality. He is on the floor every night, and he is the best dressed busser in the world. And that's how he fits into the grand scheme of things. There are master sommeliers out there that can barely tie a tie, let alone talk to anybody about the sale of wine, because they're so stuck in theory. They're so stuck in the AVA of Malta versus how can I sell you, neighborhood trattoria, this Pinot Grigio? They can't do it. And that's why I got in some like trouble about this when in another interview I said that I think that being Food and Wine Sommelier of the Year is more understandable to a guest than being a Master Sommelier. Because you can understand what that means. Being a Master Sommelier is amazing. It is the apex of everything that we do right in our industry. But most people don't understand that once you pass that test, you still got to go back out in the car and you still got to bring the bag around.
Right.
And that's the part of it that we lack understanding of in our industry. Of we need to get back to the core consumer, which at the end of the day doesn't care about that. They don't care about any of that. I've never worn a pin that I've been given in my life on the floor. I take it off as soon as they put it on.
Well, it sounds like what you're doing with Second City Soil is getting over all of this dysfunction, for lack of a better term, that's going on in the wine industry and the restaurant industry. And hats off to you. And so you're basically, you work for both the restaurant side and the supplier side. Is that how it works?
I'm working for everybody.
You're working for everybody. That's great, because you no longer have us versus them, because there's you.
Right. There are holes in the dam from point A to point B. The winery thinks that the supplier needs to do more. The supplier thinks the distributor needs to do more. The distributor thinks the buyer is flaky and doesn't do their part of it. If I can plug the hole in the gap in each of those different things, then we start getting a better understanding of how each person works. And, there are very few people that I actually started as an importer before I was a sommelier. I started on that side of the world, which is kind of screwed up and backwards of what most people do. But I understand as a buyer what it takes to be a seller. And I don't think a lot of buyers really understand what that is like. And when I'm a buyer and I want to negotiate a by the glass price on Pinot Grigio, the last person that I should ask is my sales rep, because they have to ask their sales manager, who asks the brand manager, who asks the supplier, who then asks the winery, because everybody has to basically pay for the price. Why don't I, as a buyer, just call the winery? And my best friends in the industry are suppliers. When I left the restaurants, the last people that I talked to are the sales reps. It was like I died when I left the restaurant floor for Gage to my sales reps. I haven't heard from them in months, because the reality is like that kind of relationship is they need the sale that's in front of them today. And because I'm not buying from them today, I'm no longer relevant to them.
Right.
Which is a harsh reality, but you have to understand that totally makes sense. And I don't fault them for that. They have to do what they have to do today, and they need to continue to do business with Gage Hospitality Group, which they should, because it's amazing. But I'm not Gage Hospitality Group anymore. I'm doing something else. And the suppliers are the ones that are really continuing to foster those relationships, because the new restaurants that I'm working with now, which I have 14 restaurants that I'm consulting for now, I don't have the same sales reps that I did before, because it's a different part of the city, or it's a different account, or whatever. And I talk to new people now. And so the sooner that as a buyer, you can understand how the whole process works, you can start being a better negotiator and a better business person, because the sales rep is the last person that you want to ask about pricing, because they have to ask 4 people.
Right. Well, if there's a restaurateur or a supplier who's listening right now, what is the best way to get started to work with you and get more information about how they can work with you?
Email is best. So it's Jon, Jon, at secondcitysoil.com. It's great of kind of in my business model of what I thought this would be. I'm kind of in year 2 of a plan. It's 6 months already. So I think that what I'm doing is definitely something that is needed. And my goal next year is to kind of create my own Justice League of sommelier consultants around the country, and really create better national programming and national conversations. So I'm fielding calls all the time, which is amazing. And I want to work with people that realize that they don't really know what's happening in Chicago, and they don't understand why they're not doing as well as they thought they should. And so my goal is to help answer that question. And the way that I do things is just be as honest and creative as possible and try and change the model. So if you're listening out there, shoot me an email and I'll help you sell more wine.
That's great, Jon. So even if someone is outside of Chicago, they should still send you a note and maybe get a little help, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are, just because I'm not in LA doesn't mean that I can't help you in LA. Our wine business is a very small world. It's a very incestuous world. And one way or another, my guest today is your guest tomorrow kind of mentality of just because I can't necessarily help you in this market today doesn't mean that I can't tomorrow. I think we all need the strategies to just help us negotiate the realities of our business today in a new, modern, busier world. And so there are a lot of ways to do that, and a lot of ways that I can help different entities kind of make lives easier and more efficient and more economical.
Awesome. Jon, thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Wine Biz 360. Do you have a sales story, question, or want to be a guest on the show? Visit winebiz360.com and let us know.